This is the story of how a little mouse, me, went from singing holiday jingles to sieging castles in all-out medieval warfare. This is a deep dive into the full Medieval Mice Saga, all of the lore, all of the betrayal, and everything that's happened so far. If you're just seeing the Medieval Mice Saga for the first time, this video will get you up to speed, and if you've seen episodes before, this will fill in any gaps you may have missed. So grab some cheese, sit back, and let's dive in. Things started off simple. In the beginning, the House of Mouse, our faction, had no real competition. We loved two things: cheese and trebuchets. Together, the mice and the flying squirrels ruled the land. But it wasn't always easy. We took losses from time to time, like our beloved siege tower named Siegfried, who was burned to the ground by a volley of flaming arrows. Don't worry, we conquered that castle too, Trojan horse style, but it left a void. Even with our battle horns, siege machines, and trebuchets, Siegfried's presence was sorely missed. So, we reconstructed him with cheese. All was merry and well. That was until Lord Lizard. He had a cheese stockpile as high as the eye could see, breeding an army of baby lizards behind their castle walls. But here's the thing. We were once allies with the Lizard Legion. We had open trade, but those selfish lizards decided to blockade our ports. They even kidnapped our goats, so we couldn't make cheese anymore. So, we conquered their navy and sieged their castle. But the only problem was, they had set mouse traps, and suddenly, I was a prisoner. This sent the House of Mouse into total war against the Lizard Legion, launching burning cattle with our trebuchets, sending the Squirrel Squadron over the walls, and unleashing our siege machine. I was freed, and I had no choice but to Spartan kick Lord Lizard into a pit filled with hungry wolves. It sounds ruthless, but I didn't leave him empty-handed. That's because I threw my mighty sword, Kevin the Claymore, down there with him. But why would I do that? First, we need to cover a little backstory. You see, the House of Mouse has always been stepped on by cats, lizards, and moles. We had a good thing going with the moles. But when a lizard cavalry came after us, we sheltered in the mole holes. The only problem was, those crafty lizards bribed the moles to kick us out. Lucky for them, I was a forgiving mouse. We even gave the moles protection when our army grew strong enough, for a fee, of course. But when the moles didn't pay up, I was furious. So it was time for vengeance. We salted their crops and laid siege to their castle, but meanwhile, the moles had laid explosives beneath us. So, in the dead of night, we moved underground and repositioned those explosives beneath the moles' castle, blowing them to smithereens. We gave their base to our canine allies, and I thought I had eliminated all of the moles. It turned out, one mole mercenary was out crusading during all of this. We had taken out his family, and he swore vengeance against me. In the trail of destruction we had left, we missed one of the baby lizards too, who the mole formed an alliance with. But our strength was growing. We had integrated catapults and hot air balloons too, launching more flaming cattle than ever before at our enemies. Our next target was the Capybara colony, led by King Capy. You see, when we were fleeing from the cats, we asked the capybaras for protection. That was until King Capy left us out to dry, so it was time for payback. Little did I know that the canine I thought was our ally had told the pesky mole our plan to siege the capybaras, and now they had advanced notice. I knew this because when he fled, he left behind a scroll that said everything. So I sent my shadow mice to dispose of the mole mercenary once and for all. They struck when the mole and baby lizard were sleeping, but they were ambushed by the capybara archers. Then they sent the shadow mouse heads to my throne. I needed to send a strong message to not only defeat the capybaras, but also recruit their firstborns into the House of Mouse. So, I forced the beavers to stop building dams and instead build a bigger trebuchet to break through the formidable capybara walls. They didn't stop there. They built us giant battering rams, springalds, mantles, ballistas, ladders, winches, siege towers, onagers, war carts, shields, and burning barrels. Escalades alone wouldn't do. Then came the turning point of the war. The mole mercenary had snuck into our ranks wearing a mouse mask disguise. He had poisoned our cheese supply. Fortunately, I had strong counterintelligence, so I knew his plan all along. Now that the beavers had finished building for us, we no longer needed them, so I gave them the poison. This was my biggest folly to date. I thought the poison was for me, but all along, the mole mercenary knew I would give it to the beavers. Then, in the dead of night, the mole mercenary burned down all of our siege gear, knowing we wouldn't have any beavers left to rebuild. It was a diabolical plan, and our beloved Siegfried the siege tower had turned into fondue. Now, I know what you're thinking. Mouse King, what's the big deal? Just leave the capybaras alone and rule the epic kingdom you've built. But here's the problem. I lied to you. Earlier, I told you I wanted vengeance against the lizards, against the moles, and against capybaras. But even though they betrayed me, I was over it. I actually thought these things were all pretty trivial at this point. The truth is that this was all part of a bigger plan devised by the Perilous Possum. He had kidnapped Queen Mousella, forcing the House of Mouse to start wars over these past gripes. Why? Because the Perilous Possum was enraged about one thing: the High Table. The possums claimed that their foremothers built the very land we stand on, clearing pests and making it hospitable for other factions. But when the capybaras, moles, and lizards gained power, they erased the history books of the possums' work. Then, they formed the High Table to govern the land, but they left the possums out. So in the shadows, the possums built the most formidable army in the land. If you ask King Capy about the High Table, though, it's a whole different story where the capybaras, lizards, and moles were held down at Circe by the possums and formed the High Table in secrecy to break the shackles. Fast forward. Now, as part of our agreement with the possums, they would free Queen Mousella if we defeated the moles, lizards, and capybaras. Otherwise, they would kill her, something they were eager to do since she was eating all of their cheese supply. Little did I know that Moletta, the mole mercenary's wife, was also held hostage by the possum pack. As I left the possum's walls, the mole mercenary came out of the woodwork and revealed all of this. It was then that he made a promise. If I surrendered to him and King Capy, they would break Queen Mousella free. What other choice did I have? Without any siege gear, we had no chance of defeating the capybaras. So I sacrificed myself and was given a 2-year life sentence. It was for my queen. But when King Capy and the mole mercenary went to uphold their side of the bargain, they realized just how strong the possum pact was. They had thousands of possums in their ranks, and now they had awakened a sleeping giant. The possum pact was coming to take down the capybara colony. It was then that I received a cheese delivery in the mail. In the cheese was a hidden note from the flying squirrels, reporting that King Capy and the mole mercenary failed to rescue Queen Mousella. In the note, there was a key to set myself free. Realizing that they needed a brilliant tactician to survive against the possums, King Capy and the mole mercenary asked me to join their army, but now their words were empty to me. With the key in hand, I could free myself, and I could rally my army, but more importantly, I could play the waiting game. Knowing that the possums and capybaras were destined for total war, waiting it out on the sidelines meant that both armies would be weakened by the time either side claimed victory. Then, the House of Mouse could sweep in and take them all down. It was the perfect plan, but then something came I never expected. Locked in the shadows of my cell was Lord Lizard. If you remember, I had kicked him into the wolf hole, and now he wanted vengeance. But in this moment, I revealed to him that it was I who left Kevin the Claymore in the hole with him. I had always planned to spare him because if it weren't for the possum, I would have never waged war against the Lizard Legion. Even still, he was furious that while he was in the hole, the mole mercenary took his son. Instead of returning his son, however, the mole mercenary locked up the lizard, which is how he ended up in the cell with me. But even with Kevin the Claymore in his hands, he spared me. He had a bigger plan in mind to rescue his son, so using the key, we made our escape, took out the capybara guards, stole their armor, and launched ourselves into the air using a trebuchet. The flying squirrels then swooped in and brought us to safety, and by then, I was sick of the lizard's demands. Fortunately, Kevin the Claymore is a loyal friend, and handed himself back over to me. I would be making the plans from now on, and so I told the lizard this. You want your son, I want my queen, we must revive my war machine. There was just one problem. While I was locked away, my cousin Scurry took the reins. He claimed that I let the House of Mouse fall because of my soft spot for Queen Mousella, and he refused to relinquish control to me. He stabbed me in the back. I'd built the House of Mouse, and he rode my coattails. It was a coup d'etat from my own mice, but I had a plan. The Owl Overlord owed me a favor, and it was time to call it in. This was risky, because the Owl Order is unpredictable and mysterious, but I couldn't let a traitor leave the House of Mouse. I had no choice. So the owl, lizard, Kevin, and I swooped in at dusk. But as the owl took Scurry away, he turned around and warned me that his debt had been repaid, and if we meet again, I'd be his prey. In the meantime, King Capy and the Mole Mercenary discovered that Lord Lizard and I had fled. They were furious, but with the Possum Pact drawing near, they had no choice but to prepare for total war. With the bulk of the Possum army dedicated to battling the Capybaras, we knew it was our time to strike. So we rode to the Possum headquarters and stormed the walls to rescue Queen Mousella. But when we got there, all that was left was Moletta's lifeless body and a note. It said we were too late, and that the Possums took Queen Mousella. Now they would force her to be the first up the Capybara walls, a death sentence. Without hesitation, we saddled up and rushed to the front lines. On our way, Lord Lizard's son, formerly the baby lizard, had emerged, miraculously escaping from the Mole Mercenary. But it was suspicious because he asked for all of our siege plans. Foolishly, Lord Lizard told him, revealing that if we rescued Queen Mousella, the House of Mouse would return the Lizard Legion's navy. Little did we know that the Mole Mercenary had actually brainwashed the lizard's son, using him as a spy. The lizard's son now believed that his father abandoned him. More on that in a bit. While she was locked up, Queen Mousella had been growing angrier by the day. The possums said that the mice weren't a threat, which only added fuel to the fire. Meanwhile, the Perilous possum planned to use Moletta as a bargaining chip to get the Mole Mercenary and King Capy to surrender, which would have meant the possums would reign supreme. This was a risk Queen Mousella wasn't willing to take, so to eliminate the risk, she killed Moletta, and to mobilize the House of Mouse, she wrote the letter claiming she had been kidnapped. In reality, Queen Mousella had freed herself, channeling her skills as a knight, top jouster, ace archer, and medieval freak. After her escape, she quickly reunited with me and intercepted the mouse army before they interrupted the Capybara Possum War. But she also revealed to the lizard's son that she was the one who killed Moletta. During this, the Capybara colony was running low on the burning oil they were using to ward off the Possum Pact. In an act of desperation, they were forced to bring out Treby the Trebuchet, the most powerful trebuchet in the land. During this time, the lizard's son reported to the Mole Mercenary that Queen Mousella had killed Moletta. So, relying on his old tactics, the mole sent the lizard's son back with poison to take me out and Queen Mousella and bring heads back to him. But as he made his way through the mole tunnels, he had no idea that Lord Lizard had been following him and heard the entire plan. Lord Lizard tried to tell him the truth. He told his son that they could sail the world together once they get their navy back, but he wouldn't listen. Left with no other option, he was forced to kill his own son. He was simply too brainwashed by the mole. I was inspired by disloyalty, so I gave Lord Lizard his fleet back, which we could conveniently use to blockade the Capybaras and put more strain on their total war. The Lizard Legion would make the perfect proxy. But as the navy made its way, the terrible turtle reared his ugly head and began sinking our ships. Why? For revenge. You see, the beaver builders and the turtle tribe had a symbiotic relationship, so when the beavers were poisoned, the turtles' habitat was ruined. But they pinned it on me, not the Mole Mercenary. So I kidnapped the turtles' eggs for collateral damage. After some discussion, I finally got through the turtle's thick shell, and I made an offer the terrible turtle couldn't refuse. I'd give back the turtle eggs, and he could get vengeance on the Mole Mercenary if he steals Treby the Trebuchet. That way, the moles and capybaras would have one less tool in their arsenal. Then, I promised to use Treby's stout oak beams to rebuild the turtle tribe's habitat. But when the terrible turtle arrived on shore, it was the worst-case scenario. That's because the Owl Order had struck, leaving both the Possum Pact and Capybara colony in shambles. I then rode on his shell to the shore, where there were no moles, no cappies, and no possums to be seen. It was a wasteland of bones and owl pellets, but lurking in the shadows, the mole mercenary was still alive. He had abandoned the Capybara colony after the Possum Order had overran them, but on that very day was when the owls struck. Worst of all, the mole mercenary was still out for revenge. On the flaming remains, he confronted me for slaying his family and for Mousella murdering Moletta. Kevin the Claymore and I battled it out against the mole mercenary, but when Kevin was dislodged from my grasp, the mole mercenary was one sword strike away from sealing my fate. Suddenly, my life was flashing before my eyes. I was taken back to a time when I was a young mouse, living as a peasant, but all along, my parents had told me that I would bring greatness to the House of Mouse. As I grew, however, I learned how mice were stepped on at each turn. The mole mercenary didn't care, though. He had no sympathy, especially since I chose not to join him and King Capy against the Possum Pact. Before he could strike me down, the Owl Overlord swept in. Up against this much more deadly foe, the mole mercenary had a sudden change of heart. Together, we leapt into the mole hole, landing into a liquid pond of cheese. It turned out to be fondue, and none other than Siegfried himself. The mole mercenary had saved me, but now we were in the mole hole, and my fate would be decided by the mysterious Mole King. Meanwhile, Queen Mousella and Lord Lizard were making their way full speed to the shore on a daring rescue mission, as were the flying squirrels. As for King Capy, he was being held prisoner by the Owl Overlord, who offered to join forces, but King Capy refused. As I spent time in the mole lair, I discovered that it was filled with crusading moles who I had completely missed when we blew up the moles the first time. These were much deadlier moles, though, and they'd tear me to shreds if they saw me. So, the mole mercenary gave me a mask and Kevin the Claymore, who had fallen into the mole hole. That way, I could at least make it to the Mole King without perishing. That's because the Mole King does things different. To live, I would need to defeat him in a duel. In the meantime, Queen Mousella and Lord Lizard made their way into the ball hole on a daring rescue mission, where Siegfried told her to follow the cheese footprints, which led her to the underground arena and countless moles standing by. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm late for a duel. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned to the Medieval Mice Saga for more.